Serious.
Place the gold chair.
Well, it is compared to the others. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kate Seeley with the Middle East Institute, and thank you for joining us for today's talk and book signing with author and MEI scholar Daniel Serwer. He'll be discussing his recently published book, Writing the Balance: How You Can Help Protect America, published this year by Potomac Press. Today's event is part of a larger series of book talks and book signings that we have launched since the renovation of our lovely library, the Oman Library at the Middle East Institute, which, if you haven't visited, I would like to point out to you. It's in a carriage house in the back of this garden and holds 19,000 volumes on the Middle East, mostly in English, some in Arabic and Persian. And it's open to the public from 9 to 5 and is a wonderful place to browse and relax. So check it out if you like it. Please make a contribution to MEI at mei.edu. It gives us great pleasure to host Dan Serwer today, who's been a very active MEI scholar, writing, blogging, and tweeting through his peacefair.net, his site, his blog, about many things, but largely about, these days, the Syrian conflict. And given his expertise and experience on conflict resolution and peace building, he's brought some very thoughtful writing and analysis to the Syrian conflict on issues like transitional justice and how to address the protection of minorities, among other topics. So please check out his writings on peacefair.net. When Dan is not tweeting, he's teaching, and he's a senior research professor of conflict management at SAIS, as well as a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, also at SAIS. And somehow in between his academic work and his scholarly work, he also found time to write a book, tapping into his years of experience in the government and in conflict resolution to argue that America can better protect itself, not by relying exclusively on its military might, but by building and supporting its institutions of soft power, its civilian instruments, its diplomats, its aid workers, its humanitarians, and its entrepreneurs to help build peace and create a more stable world. But how can the U.S. do this at a time when resources are strapped? And what does it even matter, he argues in his book, which he then goes on to answer very eloquently. By the way, we'll be selling the books afterwards for $20, so please sign up and buy a copy. Certainly, Dan has had many years to think about these issues. Prior to joining SAIS, he was the vice president for the Centers of Peace Building and Innovation at USIP, where he led teams working on rule of law, religion, economics, and other fields. He was also VP for Peace and Stability Operations at USIP and served as executive director of the Iraq Study Group. But he also spent years in government, where he became acutely aware of what more the State Department should and could be doing to promote peace worldwide. Among the hats he wore there, he was U.S. Special Envoy and Coordinator for the Bosnian Federation, mediating between Croats and Muslims and negotiating the first agreement reached at the Dayton peace talks, which is quite an accomplishment. There are many, many fascinating experiences about these negotiations, by the way, which he draws upon in his very enlightening book. So please join me in welcoming Dan Serwer.
Well, thank you very much, Kate, for that very kind introduction. And it's truly an honor to present at Middle East Institute, which welcomed me among its scholars when I moved from USIP to SAIS just 3 years ago. And I have to admit that getting the book done in those 3 years, you know, the last year is devoted to production, so it's really done in the first 2 years. That would never have been possible without a steady supply of MEI interns who did an enormous amount of fact-checking, footnoting, and all sorts of other challenging tasks for the book. As I'm going to say some harsh things about the State Department and USAID, and I see some people who have shared careers in the State Department with me, and even suggest that they be abolished in favor of a single foreign office, I'd like to emphasize from the first I have enormous respect for the Foreign Service and the devotion of its officers to pursuing America's interests abroad. And I feel the same way about the U.S. military. But I don't think the Foreign Service is well served by the institutions that hire, pay, and deploy our diplomats and aid workers. This distinction between institution and the core of people is not always made, and it's very important to make it. I don't think our military, nor do I think our military should be called upon to make up for civilian deficiencies, which was what's been going on for a long time now. Writing the Balance, this book, is aimed at correcting those imbalances. But it doesn't start there. It starts with the broad sweep of American history, which has given our military a leading role in America's foreign affairs, at least since the French and Indian War. And I set out early in doing my research for the book to investigate that question. When did the military become so dominant? Since I was born in 1945, I figured it was 1945. That must have been. And you have to, it simply isn't true. It's been dominant for way long before that in American foreign affairs. Americans think of their country as a peaceful one, but in fact we've had the troops deployed in conflict zones for more than a quarter of our history, not counting wars against pirates and American Indians, which were quite common through the 19th century, of course. And we've had troops deployed abroad in conflict zones every year since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is exactly the opposite of the experience of most of the rest of the world, which has been perceiving more interstate peace. There is a lot more interstate peace. We have been fighting more. With each of these wars, we improved our technology, expanded our reach, becoming by the end of the 20th century the world's only remaining superpower. We have a strong, well-exercised military arm for projecting power. It's so strong that it is reaching a point of diminishing returns. Every additional dollar buys minuscule improvement. If you don't believe that, take a look at the recent article, scholarly article by Dan Dresner, which proves this point beautifully. Our civilian capacities are far more limited. This was glaringly apparent in Iraq and Afghanistan, where state and AID have struggled and all too often failed to meet the requirements. There's just no question that in Afghanistan, when we leave the governance situation, which was a State Department responsibility, will not be in good shape. This kind of failure is more important than it ever has been before. The enemies who cause us problems today simply are not often states. Saddam Hussein's Iraq fell very quickly, as did the Taliban government in Afghanistan. We won those wars. We lost the peace. The main threats today come not from other strong states, but from non-state actors who find haven and support in fragile, weak, and collapsed states. National security, which has always been more than a military mission, now requires state-building capacities that are sorely lacking in both state and AID. They've scrambled hard, I don't want to deny that, to meet the needs in Bosnia, Kosovo, South Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan. I was part of the scrambling in Bosnia, at least. But things are not much better configured today than they were when I went to Sarajevo for the first time in November of 1994. Some of you should be thinking, that's okay, because we never want to do this state-building stuff ever again. It's not only my colleague Michael Mandelbaum who thinks that way. Each and every president since 1989 has told himself that, and each and every one has discovered that it's far easier to go to war and kill enemies than it is to withdraw, leaving behind a collapsed state that regenerates those enemies. Unless you're willing to fight forever, then that's even longer than the long war. You need to build capable states that treat their citizens reasonably well. We're discovering this today, in particular in Yemen, where the drone war appears to have created more terrorists than it has killed. This is one of the main reasons why President Obama has avoided military intervention in Syria. But the post-war effort in Syria is going to be a major one, whether it's an American primarily an American responsibility or not. I assume it won't be primarily an American responsibility. The same is true in eastern DRC and Colombia, where peace is threatening to break out after decades of war in both those places. America won't be able to avoid being engaged when North Korea or Cuba collapses. There's a very good book out, by the way, on collapse of North Korea from a colleague at RAND, if you're interested. Nor will we be able to stay aloof if nuclear-armed Pakistan starts coming apart. Let's not even think about Iran. So my view is that we need to prepare for the day that we'll have to do these things again, not continue to delude ourselves that we will never do it again. In fact, that's what gets us into this bad cycle. Presidents don't want to do it, so they don't prepare for it, so it's done badly. They have to rush the effort to mobilize people. It's done badly, and so they don't want to do it ever again. But the book is not about post-war state building, a subject I teach at SAIS that draws a lot of those experiences. But I have to admit that post-war state building is hard and expensive. Anticipation is cheaper and better. We need civilian foreign policy instruments that will take early action to prevent states from collapsing and help initiate reforms. We may need occasionally to do a post-war reconstruction job. But that's not what I would have us doing most of the time, and I would avoid it as much as we possibly could. The remarkable thing is that we've been reasonably successful at allowing political and economic reform to take place in much of Latin America and East Asia, where recent decades have seen many countries turn in the direction of democratic transition, more or less democratic transition. Brazil, where I served in the 1980s, I'll never forget, the American embassy couldn't believe it when President Figueiredo told the ambassador that he was tired of governing Brazil and he wanted to go back to playing with his tanks, and he was going to turn it back over to the civilians, which he then proceeded to do. But it's not only Brazil, it's Chile, it's South Korea, it's Indonesia. These are sterling examples of transitions that the United States, in one way or another, may have nurtured, encouraged, or at least allowed, and much to our benefit, needless to say. That's what we failed to do effectively in the Arab world, with consequences that are now on the front pages every day. We failed to anticipate the revolution of Tunisia. In Libya, we failed to help the new regime establish a monopoly on the means of violence, a failure that cost us an ambassador and 3 of his colleagues. In Egypt, we've been inconstant, supporting whoever and whatever gains power. In Syria, we failed to support moderates, only to see them displaced and replaced by extremists. Let me be specific about the areas in which I think state and the idea are lacking capability today. First, mobilizing early action. These are reactive organizations. They are not proactive organizations. Second, reforming security services. The failures in Iraq and Afghanistan are well known, well documented by the special inspectors general in those 2 places. Promoting democracy. oddly, is an area that our institutions are weak in, even if I hasten to add that I'm a great admirer of NDI, IRI, and NED. But just the fact that I have to name 3 organizations to get the point across suggests that there might be something wrong with what some people call the democracy bureaucracy. Fourth is countering violent extremism. Much to my astonishment, I discovered that until the last couple of years, the United States had done virtually nothing on the international level to counter violent extremism. When Dan Benjamin testified in Congress on this subject, I think it was in 2010, he told them that there was $100,000 in each of 15 embassies devoted to countering violent extremism. And when the Congress people said, I mean, that's ridiculous. It's 10 years, almost 10 years after 9/11. He said, well, get us more money, which, of course, if you've ever testified in Congress for an administration, is the thing you're never supposed to say, because you're supposed to back the president's proposal. But Dan actually said, well, we could use a little help here. Since 2010, there have been some efforts to establish a fund, an international fund for countering violent extremism and other things, but we're still nowhere near scale on that subject. The point is that these are all efforts at the periphery of traditional diplomacy. And I readily admit that the 3 last that I mentioned, promoting democracy, countering violent extremism, and encouraging citizen and cultural diplomacy, that those are better done, for the most part, outside government, with government support, while the first 2, mobilizing early action and reforming security services, are more inherently governmental functions. But I don't think we can get these things done with our current institutions, which were designed for very different purposes and in other eras. Inertia and legacy are just too strong. What I think we need to do is ask ourselves a question. I'm a scientist by original training, so I think I do what scientists do, which is to conduct thought experiments. That's experiments in your head. And you ask yourself, given what we know about the challenges today, and for the next 10 or 20 years, do we have the institutions that are needed to face those challenges? And I'm not just talking about the amounts of money. I'm talking about the configuration, the architecture of our institutions. State Department established in the 18th century. Why is it called the State Department? Anybody happen to know? Do I have any? It's a little known story. The first Congress created a foreign office and then decided it wouldn't have enough work to do. So it threw it in with the grab bag, 4th department of government. There was War, there was Treasury, and there was the Attorney General, and that 4th branch was the Department of the State, because it did everything, including sealing government documents, which is why the Great Seal of the United States is in the State Department. It sealed domestic documents as well as international ones. I won't go through the history of the State Department. It's a long one, but it's one mostly of giving up functions. Many functions it has given up, including many in my lifetime. And today, I think it's arguable that it simply does not control American foreign policy. USAID was founded to help alleviate poverty in Europe in the wake of World War II, when European economies were in a deep slide. I don't think either one is what we need to face the kinds of issues that I've been discussing. I think we need to rebuild from the ground up with current and future requirements in mind. Now, some people have interpreted me to mean that we should fire all the Foreign Service officers and all the USAID officers and hire new ones. That's not at all what I'm talking about. I think many of the people in USAID and in state, especially those who've done service in Iraq, Afghanistan, and who've learned how to do the state building function rather well, that they would serve very well in new institutions. It's the institutions and the culture of those institutions that I think is wrong, not the people. The book doesn't offer a detailed design on what kind of institution we need. I think that's a job for a lot of people, not one person. But it does suggest that we'd be better off with a single foreign office, as well as a much enhanced non-governmental effort, operated more at arm's length from officialdom than we do today. You just have to talk to people in these institutions to learn that they are on a very tight leash right now. But I think we frankly need much greater congressional funding for our democracy, countering violent extremism, citizen diplomacy efforts than we're spending today. I'm not prepared to propose, however, as so many have before me, that this be funded by an F-22, or maybe two F-22s. I think state and AID have the resources they need. This is one of the sad parts of the story, but unfortunately tied up in elephantine embassies supporting other U.S. government agencies. Now, I will tell you only my personal story. I was Deputy Chief of Mission in Charge at the embassy in Rome. I had 36 different agencies of the U.S. government represented there. 90% of the State Department officers who were stationed there were there to support other agencies. When I calculated how many people I needed for the essential diplomatic and consular work of the United States, it was 32, and that was a generous number. I, in fact, had 400 Americans and 400 Italians working for me. This is outrageous. No other government on earth except the Chinese do things this way. We have to learn how to have much smaller, much more agile embassies that can be plussed up with temporary deployments when the need arises. Shrinking the embassies dramatically would provide the funds for a much sleeker and more effective foreign office, including a corps of several thousand people able and willing to deploy with or without U.S. troops to difficult environments to take on the hard work of conflict prevention as well as state building where it's required. What we need is a far more agile, anticipatory, and mobile foreign service, one built for a world in which virtually everyone will soon be connected to worldwide communications, and ordinary citizens count for much more than ever before in world history. And if you think our ambassadors and diplomats are talking a lot to ordinary citizens from behind the 20-foot-high walls in Baghdad, I got news for you, they're not. They can't. I can do that much more easily when I go into Benghazi and Tripoli quietly and without protection shortly after Gaddafi fell from Tripoli. There are ways of operating. International Crisis Group is showing us some of them. Economist Intelligence Unit is showing us others. There are ways of operating that are much lighter and more agile than what we've saddled ourselves with in these gigantic embassy establishments. Let me stop there and hope that I've challenged some people to ask some questions.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that, putting forth your vision of a reformed state and USAID, AID, and of course, I imagine defense as well, although you don't get into that in the book.
I don't do defense and I don't do intelligence.
Very wise.
But I've got to say that the virtue of the Defense Department and the military generally is that it is looking at itself constantly.
Right.
It may not always do the right things, but it is a self-examining institution. The intelligence side is a mess, and but it's going to take a much thicker book than this one. I mean, it took Dana Priest a much thicker book than this one to just document how they've expanded. So to talk about how they need to be reformed is going to really be a major project, and the data isn't available.
Well, I agreed with many of the recommendations, but I had a question about, you call for leaner, meaner embassies, and as part of this reform, you call for more engagement of the private sector in projecting soft power in the region. And I sort of wonder, as somebody who's encountered a lot of these for-profit organizations doing democracy in the region, I mean, they're also not-for-profit, but I wonder often how those can do this job better than sincere diplomats and USAID employees who have more oversight. Could you talk a little bit about that balance between the private sector and the public sector in projecting American values and goals?
I want to shift the frame a little bit. To me, the issue is in private sector, profit-making, nonprofit. To me, the question is whether you're using a contracting model or a mission-oriented model. I would regard NED, for example, is basically mission-driven. You give them the money, they set their goals, they have congressional oversight, but over the money that NED gets directly from the Congress, there's relatively little administration control. The problem is that more and more the Congress, in a mistaken effort to encourage better coordination, has been pumping money through the administration, so that especially for these post-war interventions, money has been going from State Department, USAID, into contractors. And I don't think, I don't want to enter into the debate of profit versus non-profit contractors. Contractors are contractors. And frankly, I don't think profit and non-profit contractors have very different motives. They're both after making money. Nonprofits don't distribute that money to shareholders, but they're still in business. I'd rather see mission-driven organizations than contracting organizations. I think the Congress has made a mistake in shifting so much towards, and I face this at USIP as well, it's common in the semi-governmental world that you're finding more and more of your money coming from the administration and driven by a contractor mentality. I hope I'm not revealing I'm hoping I'm not being indiscreet when I mention that I've seen the requirements for quantitative assessment of some things that contractors are asked to do. It's absurd. It's absurd is the only way to describe it. It's complete nonsense, a quantification that cannot be done in combat conditions. It's just totally impossible to meet the requirements, and that's part of the contractor mentality rather than the mission-driven mentality. So if I may, I want to shift it in that direction. I think we need to trust the organizations that we empower and let them go out and do their work. And I think we have good reason to trust some of these organizations.
Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute. You mentioned the name, the Foreign Office, as you said you didn't go in your talk and haven't read the book about how that might be designed and so on. But are there any examples of other states which have done it properly? Foreign Office is a term that exists in the UK. They had a large empire at one point. But my real question is the challenge about how the attempt is being made, or real fundamental changes in the way society and states and countries are evolving. I mean, at one point, 300 British officials ran all of India. And they managed reasonably well. I'm sure they had bureaucratic hurdles and problems. But if you look at today's India or today's Iraq, in the U.S. in the 50s, cheaply organized a coup in Iran and managed afterward, with the, I mean, politics was so fundamentally different decades ago. My question to you is, aside from sort of the mechanics of how you set up State Department, USAID, and of course they've failed in Iraq and Afghanistan if one says, they wanted to succeed in state building, but what about the fundamental challenges of attempting, through foreign, whether it's embassy or other, to organize, govern, build states in other societies which today are so turbulent, so empowered, so complex that even their own governments are unable to manage them. And hence, even if you reform all of these institutions of the U.S., is it reasonable to think that the U.S., like it maybe could have in the 50s or the British could in the 19th century, actually do what you're saying might be doable?
That's a very tough question. Let me go to the first one first. There are definitely some governments that punch above their weight in the peace-building business, and certainly Norway, Sweden do, and they do it very effectively with very, very few people. And so I think there are some examples out there. One thing you have to realize is I had lunch recently with a woman who's now an ambassador abroad, and I asked her, she was a principal deputy assistant secretary in the State Department, and I asked her, what do you find yourself doing most of the day? She said, we're overwhelmed with people. We spend our days in meetings coordinating with everybody else. Well, that's not a very productive thing to be doing, and that's what a lot of our embassies are doing too. Let me tell you, as DCM in Rome, I spent a lot of time coordinating the efforts of 36 different agencies of the U.S. government, 3/4 of whom had very little business being there, and we did get them to draw down quite a bit, but boy, it was really loony. The Canadians have folded their aid institution into their foreign office. I think that aid should serve national security purposes. That's the assumption in the book. I realize that there are a lot of people who don't agree with that, who think that aid should still alleviate poverty. My answer is, well, there are precious few Americans still have confidence that the U.S. government can alleviate poverty at home. It's going to be awfully hard to do it abroad, which is a nice bridge to your second question, which is can this stuff be done in a world much more populous, much more complicated, with much greater communications than the British Empire? Well, in some way, that world should be easier to handle. Certainly the communications aspect of it makes it easier in principle and more difficult in practice, because the State Department is the last remaining place where you'll find a 5,000-mile screwdriver. I mean, they are just determined to control everything from Washington and don't trust their people. Typically an American Foreign Service officer reaches the rank of ambassador without having managed more than a couple of $1,000s and half a dozen people. It's absolutely absurd to put such people in charge of gigantic embassies. Everything is controlled from Washington. And that's a model that I think is simply a bad model. And I think it's a bad model. I'm looking at Fred. I'm wondering how he's going to react to this. I think it's a bad model to say that we're not going to give any aid to people who don't agree with us in Syria. I mean, this conflict zones are full of markets, and stuff is going to move from the hands of the guys you give it to somebody who wants it more and is willing to pay for it. And this notion that that we can prevent that Fast and Furious, the incident with the gun trafficking in Mexico, that incident is going to control whether we can help Syrians to fight the Bashar al-Assad regime doesn't make any sense to me. So part of the answer is I think that there are advantages in the world we have today. part of the answer is that I don't think of the state building project as a project that we do for them. I think of it as an effort that they do for themselves with our assistance and with our shaping. And if you think of it that way, you know, I think it is doable. I think it is doable. It takes time, and it takes civilians. And we've mostly used military people. Even for the Defense Ministry and the Interior Ministry in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's been mostly defense advisors or civilians who just came out of the military. And that's a mistake.
I like the idea of the mission-oriented. However, I set up an NGO in Washington, D.C. 15 years ago. It fits everything you're saying. Local people, slowly, small numbers, dedicated to conflict. But to find funds or to get a chance even to work with the contracting ones, it's impossible.
Well, I think that's, yes. It is very, very difficult, especially given the bureaucratic requirements now levied on contractors. And it's absurd. They are meaningless and stupid. And nobody will say it because anybody who has a contract doesn't want to be caught saying that because they're afraid they'll get cut off. I don't have any contracts.
You mentioned dealing with counter-extremism. And am I thinking that's dealing a lot with the symptom rather than the cause? And there's a body of literature you're probably familiar with on radicalization and forces and, you know, issues about dealing with root causes, basic human needs, legitimate causes, grievances. So I think that I mean, you have to do some counter stuff, but also that you can reduce extremism and their, you know, reverse cycles of violence. So could you speak to that, please?
Well, this is a very complicated area. I don't think it's right to identify very poor people as being the root cause of extremism. Yeah, I don't agree with that. In fact, if you look, I mean, a lot of documentation, not only on the 911 hijackers, but on others, suggests that it's quite to the contrary, rather well-educated and middle-class people who have been attracted at times to extremism. The point I would make is this, that my reading of the literature suggests that what really works is not strategic communications from the U.S. government. What works is communities, in particular we're talking Muslim communities right now, Muslim communities that deal with this issue themselves. And in particular former extremists who help communities to de-radicalize young people. There's been precious little support for that work, even though it's fairly well documented that this is an effective approach. But it's very hands-on, it's very risky, and our contracting system doesn't like risk, and it doesn't really appreciate hands-on. So, you know, my hope is that we get a mission-oriented set of organizations. It doesn't have to be one, it may have to be several, and they might be existing organizations that we plussed up a good deal, for example. I'm in no position to judge the virtues of one versus the other, but there are organizations with track records in this area, and I'd like to see them more strongly supported than was the case until a couple of years ago. the administration actually moved, while I was writing the book, I became conscious of the fact that somebody in the administration had become cognizant of this lack of effort on countering violent extremism. I haven't had a chance to talk to Dan Benjamin about it, but he can probably tell a good story about how this happened after his rather catastrophic testimony. I'd never read testimony quite like that. I mean, there were experts there who testified that there was no program. And Marine General Douglas Stone was there. He was the guy who decided we were producing more terrorists in Iraqi prisons than we were capturing, and decided on release, and then discovered that he could sort out who should be released from who shouldn't be released fairly easily. The problem was that the guys he wanted to release didn't want to leave any longer because he was doing literacy classes. And they wanted to finish their literacy classes before they left prison. And somewhat the same thing happened in Afghanistan. But this was all, I mean, at this hearing, I mean, it was very clear that the U.S. government people were at a complete loss because they just didn't have any programs. They now do have some programs. How good they are, how expensive they are, I'm not really sure. I haven't followed up on that.
I'm just curious to hear more about, related to the book title, How You Can Help Protect America, what the role of citizen diplomats and sort of how institutions can align to create more opportunities for average Americans to engage in foreign issues.
I've always been mildly uncomfortable with the subtitle of the book because I really think a lot of what I talk about is about professionals. And the part of the book that's about ordinary citizens is relatively small, but the publisher thought that was an important selling point, so they put that subtitle on the book. But with that caveat, let me say that there are just infinite opportunities today. I mean, it's just amazing. I'll just cite one that happens. I happen to be going to a concert tonight over at Smithsonian of, I think it's Iranian and Syrian music, something like that. Well, the guy who invited me is an American who is very much engaged in trying to bring the Timbuktu Festival back to Timbuktu. The Timbuktu Festival has been traveling since the problems in northern Mali, and they're trying to get it back next month. I have my doubts they're going to make it because I think the situation is still quite difficult and unstable, and but they are trying. Well, this guy is a young American who made some bucks with a company, and he established a foundation, and he's enjoying life, you know. He loves Malian music, and he's enjoying life promoting the Timbuktu Festival. Well, this is extraordinary. I mean, this is not something you could have done 40 years ago. You know, he communicates with me once every 2 weeks from who knows where in the world. And I know you're involved in the arts. I mean, especially in the arts, when did the U.S. government ever really contribute to strong exchanges in the arts? Well, the short answer to that question is during the Cold War, they did, no question about it. But the Cold War's been over for a long time now, and exchanges in the arts, in particular in music, have been in the hands of the private sector now for a long time. And with something like the Timbuktu Festival, I mean, there's a difference between just making money exporting American rap to Serbia, which is something I know people who do that. But bringing the Timbuktu Festival back to Timbuktu is something entirely different. It's real diplomacy that's required there. It's real diplomacy, it's understanding the local community, it's being in touch with the local community, it's making sure that there aren't bad actors, spoilers, on the scene, it's being in touch with the UN. None of this is better done through the embassy in Mali. It's better done by somebody who knows festivals really well. This guy actually made his money sponsoring music festivals. The opportunities, especially in the arts, are just enormous. If you only find a place where the arts count, and music really counts in Mali, it's very important. And it should be important to us too, because this is the Muslim society that treasures music. And that is something that you don't always find on this earth, and it should find some support in the West. It is finding support in the West. There are many, many ways. I mean, I go over them in one chapter in the book. I happen to be an enthusiast, so some people tell me it's a Ponzi scheme for Kiva. Kiva is this microfinance network that has raised something like $300 million for small projects abroad now. I can put money in, I happen to pick a Malian even before the troubles in Timbuktu. I can put money in her pocket with a click of my mouse. And it's one thing for me to be able to do it, but they've actually transferred over $300 million this way into small projects for smaller micro enterprises. Well, this is remarkable. Private funding has exceeded aid flows for the last 10 years at least. 10 times? Alan, you might know better than I do. I mean, the private sector is what's transferring money. People always poo-poo remittances. They always say, well, you know, that country depends on remittances. Well, remittances are very important and a very good aspect of the modern world, that you can now transfer money quickly and easily to somebody's cell phone in the Congo is really quite a remarkable advantage over, you know, when you used to fill out a little form at Western Union and they had to type it into a machine and that kind of thing. When I served in Italy for the first time in 1977, there was still a very substantial quantity of remittances coming to Italy. So don't tell me receiving remittances is bad for you. I mean, it's good for you. It's foreign investment is what it is, usually from expatriates, who are always the first to send their money back. So there are 1,001 ways, is the short answer, that even ordinary people, you know, I did a little gig one day with Sister Cities. I mean, they're doing a fantastic job connecting. And one thing I'll say, this is something that I haven't seen written up anyplace. The U.S. government has a remarkable program of connecting states to foreign countries. And it's actually a National Guard program, because the U.S. Army found it was impossible to interact with all the little armies that wanted to interact with it. How does the U.S. Army interact with the non-existent army in Kosovo? It can't. So what they did instead was to ask the Iowa National Guard to deal with Kosovo, and Macedonia gets the Vermont National Guard, and the Serbs have the Ohio National Guard. And this is a tremendous program for the armies involved, but the interesting thing about it is that it spreads. It goes to the governors, it goes to the entrepreneurs, it goes to the investors. And, you know, this is one example of many examples, ways in which diplomacy is simply multiplying in ways that the State Department can't even keep track of. The State Department doesn't even know. They know about, in principle, about the National Guard aspect of the program. They have no idea that it's spreading to the civilian sector as well, so that the president of Kosovo goes once a year or so to Iowa with some investors, and people want investment, and they've got educational exchanges. It's an extraordinary thing, and it makes sense because the states are much more the size of some of these countries. Oh, dear. I got in trouble. I like to do my Oprah thing and wander.
I can give you the microphone if you want to carry it. But then you have to choose the question, please.
In terms of reshaping the State Department, where does the leadership for that have to come from? Is that from the Oval Office? Is that from Congress? Is that from the Secretary of State? Like, who's going to be the main motivator of making that politically difficult change?
State Department is on its fourth secretary of superb quality, not just high quality. This is the fourth in a row of really superb quality secretaries of state. When I was growing up, we had people whose names you wouldn't even recognize as Secretary of State. We're in our fourth really good one. Three of them, not counting Secretary Kerry, devoted considerable attention to the State Department as an institution, trying to get more training, trying to shape up the State Department. Transformational diplomacy, Condoleezza Rice called it. It was a good idea. The QDDR of Hillary Clinton, a terrific document, best document the State Department has published in decades. All to no avail. Hasn't happened. The impact, yes, there's been an impact on personnel. They've almost doubled the size of the State Department in the last 10 years. But no impact on the mode of operation. Same old, big fat embassies supporting other agencies of the U.S. government. They had a small core of readily deployable people, and there were proposals to make it much larger. It's been zeroed out. I did talk with Secretary Kerry's people about this early in his time there, and it was very clear that he faced the same problem all secretaries of state face. Where do you put your energies? Do you put it all to the diplomacy, or do you try to fix the State Department, which is something that can't be achieved in 3 or 4 years, so it might be wasted effort? Well, I think it's fairly clear that Secretary Kerry has chosen to put his efforts into the diplomacy and not to worry so much about the State Department as an institution. In fact, I'm told that people in state feel that he's completely off on his own. I think that's a rational decision on the part of the Secretary. If you want to fix Israel, Palestine, Syria, and Iran, plus pivot to Asia Pacific, you're going to have to do some triage here. And one of the things that's going to fall by the wayside is reform of the State Department. The only way it can be done, I think, especially in the way that I propose of actually merging, you could think of what I propose as a merger. I didn't put it in those terms, but I put it in terms of getting rid of both of them and building a new institution. But that was partly for shock value. If you want to do that, it's going to have to be the President of the United States working very tightly with the Congress to get it done, because of course part of the problem is that both state and AID have their constituencies in the Congress. And every effort to merge AID into state has faced insurmountable obstacles. And those obstacles are mostly in the Congress. So it would have to be a president who, for some strange reason, decided he's not going to be unprepared next time. He's going to have what he needs. People are always complaining that National Security Council has taken over the State Department role. Well, I mean, without going into the details, if you've got a client and the client suddenly starts doing everything by himself, maybe it's because you weren't able to serve his needs adequately. And maybe you need to start rethinking how you service the National Security Council. So short answer is President of the United States, nobody else can do it. And it have to be a president who was ready to admit that the state building function or the political and economic reform function was one he really wanted to have available, that he wasn't going to be caught going into Somalia like George H.W. Bush and not doing the state building function and then discovering, well, how the hell do you get out? Well, in that case, they had a good answer. Give it to the UN and get out. But each and every president since the end of the Cold War has tried to avoid this. President Clinton saying he was going into Bosnia for only a year. We all knew it was going to be more than a year. And, you know, once that was done, saying, yep, we're never going to do this again, and then the Kosovo War comes on us, and then Iraq and Afghanistan, each one unprepared. And we'll be unprepared for the next one, too.
Things over here. Hold on.
Paul Lake, student from SAIS. Former Ambassador Edmund Hull, in his memoir from serving in Yemen, spoke about the difficulties of recruiting quality State Department personnel to serve in the embassy there. I was wondering if you see that being a common problem in embassies in unstable, challenging countries, and if so, what can be done to make sure the best personnel get where they're needed most?
I think this problem has generally been exaggerated. It's not true that State Department people aren't worldwide available. At least when I served at State, I had signed a document that said I was worldwide available, and I was ordered to at least one post that I was resisting being told, you know, you ain't got another one. If you don't go there, I'm not telling you where it is because it turned out to be a pretty good post. Really dumb resisting. So I think it's a bit of an exaggerated problem, but the short answer is you have to compensate people adequately, not only in hard cash. Actually, there's a lot of hard cash involved for going to a place like Yemen these days. I don't know what differential it has, but probably substantial. But career-wise, I mean, what State Department officers worry about is not how much money is in their pockets, but what their next rung on the ladder is going to be. You know, I think State's been pretty good lately about rewarding people who went to Iraq and Afghanistan and who are willing to do these difficult jobs. And certainly our heroes today, you know, Ryan Crocker, Jim Jeffrey, are people who served in these places. So I think, you know, I think that's really a soluble problem. It's a matter of incentives, basically. But the careers incentive is at least as important as the hard cash incentive.
Question in the back here.
I was just wondering, I know that the institutions we currently have are slow and inefficient, and they are more reactive than proactive. But at the same time, there's a benefit to it, I think, which is that the institutions we have are risk averse, and that if we cut down on, if the institution, we cut down the people we have, it becomes more risk prone because you would have to actually do something, which
That's
would lead
exactly
to.
right. That's exactly right. I don't want to minimize this point. The kind of foreign service I'm proposing would lose people every once in a while. You know, Chris Stevens knew the risks he was running. I know he knew them because he had breakfast with a professor I had to have breakfast with a couple of weeks before, and he told me all about the radicals in Cyrenaica. So he knew, and he regarded those risks as important to run for the purposes he was serving. When you have diplomats behaving that way, you are going to lose them every once in a while. There's no question about that. But the zero risk goal that has become the norm for the State Department is inconsistent with conducting diplomacy. You can't get the job done. Tom Pickering's, he wasn't the only person, but the report I associate with him, the Accountability and Review Board report on the incident in Benghazi, is very clear up front. It says we must not do anything that will hurt the ability of our diplomats to talk with people and get their job done. And then there are, I don't know, 23, 27 recommendations, all of which would hurt the ability to get the job done. Look, I'm more of a risk taker than some other people are. They're bigger risk takers than I am. You have to leave your diplomats with some flexibility to decide what risks to take. And that's not being done today.
But isn't there a way to reform the institutions you already have, make it less maybe about coordination, not to like just cutting back people? Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just like instead of like.
Is she signaling you to?
No, just the mic. Because we record everything.
Yeah, so instead of like cutting back people, maybe there's a different way of making the focus less on the coordination itself and more on the how do you coordinate with the states that you're dealing with? Because it seems
I think it's very difficult as long as you have so many domestic agencies heavily represented in the embassies. Because the domestic agencies are the ones that demand the 20-foot high walls. It's not the State Department people who won't take risks. It's other agencies that don't want to take risks. And as long as you've got these gigantesque multi-agency embassies with, I can't tell you, if I started describing the units I had in Rome, you'd just be amazed. And Baghdad is different because it was new. But it's going to be old, and it's going to have lots of pieces that aren't needed anymore. We've got to get out of that business, and we've got to get out of the business of having regional security officers whose exclusive job is to make sure that nobody ever gets hurt. I mean, and when that's your job, and you control what the ambassador does, you know, the ambassador may be able to do his job because he's going to get protection. It's all the other embassy officers who don't get the protection, who can't do their jobs, and they're important in an embassy. Thank you again, Kate, for the opportunity.
Please join me in thanking Dan Serwer. He'll be signing his books. If anybody would like to buy a book, please line up here in the corridor. Thank you.